Welcome to episode 142 of Mid-America Reformed Seminary's Roundtable Podcast, a broadcast from the Faculty of Mid-America, where they discuss all things Reformed theology and cultural issues, all from a Reformed perspective. I'm Jared Luchboard, Director of Marketing here at the seminary. Thank you for tuning in. Well, I have the pleasure today of having with me here on campus at Mid-America Associate Professor of Old Testament, Reverend Andrew Compton, soon, Lord willing, to be Dr. Andrew Compton, who is currently working on a dissertation on the book of Ezekiel. Thank you for joining me, Reverend Andrew Compton.
It's great to be back here, Jared.
Absolutely. What we'd like to explore today and in the next few episodes is what exactly it is that you're exploring in the book of Ezekiel. You know, the book of Ezekiel can be quite a bizarre piece of work for lay people in the church to tackle. We think of the many visions that Ezekiel had, the acts that he performed to show the nation of Israel what was to come, all these bizarre things that can happen. But just to enlighten us what led you to work on this particular project. And then in the next couple of episodes, we'll be diving in and exploring just a little bit more on exactly what it is that you're writing on.
Yeah, no, thank you. It is funny. A lot of people, this has been a long haul. I started here at the seminary in 2016, and then a couple of years I sort of got my bearings about what I would pursue my terminal degree in. And so I think now I'm in year 4 of this dissertation process through the University of Pretoria. So over these last couple of years then, I've gotten a lot of questions. What are you writing about? And I usually respond by saying, well, how much time do you have? So if you want a short answer, I say Ezekiel. If you have a little more time, I'll say Ezekiel's priestly identity. And it can get really out of hand really quick from there. But anyway, so it is Ezekiel, you're right. And it's funny, before we even get into it, I mean, something I did find when I was first starting to play around with Ezekiel, it makes it sound like it's a ball, right? I don't mean that. But, when I was first starting to think about it a bit more, and that was actually when I was still pastoring in California, I spent some time doing a Sunday school class on it at Christ Reformed Church. I don't think there's recordings of them. If there are, I'm sure they were terrible. So, no. But I did find that, it does have that reputation of being such an insane book to some people. Yeah. And I think a big part of it is because of that opening vision. In fact, the rabbis even thought that you had to be a certain age to read Ezekiel 1, or else you would die. And there was even a story of a little boy who accidentally read Ezekiel 1, and fire came out from the scroll and killed him.
Okay.
I doubt the veracity of that. Sure. I doubt it.
Yes.
I don't have proof that it didn't happen. It just doesn't seem very likely to me. But it just really illustrates how the book is perceived. But what's interesting is once you get through visions like that, chapter 1, through the sign acts, I always say, but those are two words, sign-acts.
Oh, not S-Y-N or A-N-X or whatever.
It's not that nasal spray.
Sign-acts.
It's the the action prophecies, some people will call them.
Okay.
But you start to get into some pretty straightforward sounding prophetic oracles, and a lot of it doesn't read very different than Isaiah or Jeremiah. You do get some very difficult passages. For example, Ezekiel 16 is very graphic. It's very difficult to read that, especially considering how Israel is portrayed as a woman being mistreated. And so there are those kinds of things. We'll fully grant it. But a lot of the book reads very straightforward, just like you'd expect Isaiah. So I think for a lot of people, I suggest if you can just forge through the parts that aren't very familiar, maybe earmark them for later study, you'll find numerous accounts that really do sound like pretty ordinary prophecy. In the 30s, you get a lot of these prophecies of restoration. You get Isaiah 36 and Isaiah 36 in particular is vision of the new heart, and Isaiah 37, the prophecy, the vision of the dry bones. And yes, it's a vision, but it feels a little more familiar when you read those. So, but he was a unique guy. He had his own historical concerns. He was bringing a prophecy to exiles, and so the contours are a little different from Isaiah.
Okay.
And his use of earlier biblical texts is a little different. So it's a unique book, but it's I think one that's gotten a bit of a bad reputation as well, just because it's hard to get into it. That way, Leviticus is like that too. You know, it's a lot of these laws and purity and things that seem very foreign to us, and then all of a sudden we get to like what is it, chapters 9 and 10, I think, where Nadab and Abihu's death, and all of a sudden you're in narrative. And you're reading through Leviticus going, oh, this sounds like I'm reading Exodus again, or maybe the early chapters in Exodus. And so a lot of Bible books will do that. But anyway, I'm not here to just defend your reading of Ezekiel. I trust our listeners believe it is the inspired and inerrant Word of God. They are right for believing that, and I'm sure they will dutifully slog through it in due time, but I do hope that they'll not be put off by it and maybe take the time to earmark the hard passages and then really relish, as it were, in the more straightforward passages. But how did I get here, though? You're probably like, how did I get to Ezekiel? So after seminary, I did start graduate work, and I spent a year at one institution with an Ezekiel scholar who had just finished a commentary on it. And then from there, I went to the University of California, and I was actually starting to lean toward writing a dissertation on the genealogies of the Book of Chronicles. And that is already starting to cue our listeners into what kind of a strange person I am. Because there too, not exactly the part of Chronicles that most people want to read, even if they do read Chronicles. But there were a few reasons for that, and I'll not get derailed from that. But in God's timing, there were needs in the church I was serving. There were just other things that were weighing on me that caused me to finish my master's degree at UCLA. I'd taken all my doctoral coursework, the full slate of seminars, but decided to stop studying there and then serve the church full time, which I did until I came here. So in that way, as I ended up putting Chronicles on hold, although I did a little bit more reading. I think just on the side, I did an academic paper presentation for an ETS meeting once. And another thing I did then is I began a doctorate of ministry program at Westminster Seminary in Philadelphia and spent a summer doing courses there. And my idea there is I'd pivoted my further study toward counseling, which is what I was doing chiefly in my church. But I wanted to look at how we can use Old Testament narratives in pastoral counseling without falling into exemplaristic kinds of readings. Something that would still remain robustly redemptive historical, robustly biblically theological, robustly Vossian and Ritter-Vossian, right? But would not neglect how even these accounts of our forefathers in the faith, how those even make us wise unto salvation and are beneficial to us in our pilgrimage. So that had been on my mind. But then in coming here, then okay, what do I look at? And that's when I started to pivot back toward Ezekiel. And so here we are. Now, how this topic, one thing you have to understand about biblical studies or doctoral degrees in biblical studies, there's very different models, there's very different kinds of schools that are doing that. But generally, it's not like just writing a commentary on a book. You're looking at a theme, typically a theme from a book of the Old Testament or a book of the New Testament, although that can change. There are some broadly canonical considerations. For example, my colleague here, Dr. Menninger, did his dissertation on a particular theme within Romans, 1-3, I think it was. And that's pretty common, right? You really need to zero in. And so I was zeroing in on Ezekiel, and something that came out several years ago was this idea of identity theory. Now, all of a sudden, everybody's buzzers are going off. Uh-oh.
Yeah, man.
Uh-oh.
Where are you going with this?
We're getting woke here. No, but there's a whole range of identity theories. And for example, there's something called social identity theory, and it just explores how societies, how a society, whether it's a small society of 8 people at a workplace or a society of 46 people who are at a family reunion every year, or a society, but it looks at how they forge an identity and how you can observe the strategies they use in creating cohesion among that society, whether it's a whole country or whether it's a small organization. Well, one of the essays I came across in a book on identity theory and research was something I had never thought of, but it was this essay on occupational identity. I went, well, that's interesting. Now, remember, the Reformed theologians have often thought very deeply about Christian vocation, right? A Christian theology of work. How do we bring glory to God in our various callings? And that was actually one of the great breakthroughs in the Reformation, was insisting that all of us had a calling, a vocatio, a vocation, not just the clergy. And so that was interesting to see a sort of, as it were, secular sociological or secular psychology approach to work identity. Well, all of a sudden that bridge to something a former professor of mine had written about Ezekiel's priestly identity. And there was a little collection of studies that were written starting in the late 1990s in through about 2005. The first was an article in the Journal of Biblical Literature by Margaret Odell about Ezekiel. And she was arguing that he, by means of very priestly sounding actions in the sign acts and in the calling, he was exchanging his priestly identity for a prophetic identity, just kind of pitting the two identities against each other and saying he relinquished his priestly identity and now was fully a prophet. And others in coming years sort of picked that up and tried to explore that. In the year 2000, the Society of Biblical Literature had a section devoted to this question. And in the seminar papers published in 2000, there's, I think, 3 essays looking at priestly identity in Ezekiel. And then a few years later, a book came out called Ezekiel's Hierarchical World, which was a symposium of essays from the Society of Biblical Literature that were looking at a range of things in Ezekiel, but there was a collection of 4 essays that were looking at his priestly identity, one of them by my former seminary professor, Ian Duguid. And now most of these are all secular essays, although Dr. Duguid is very much a Reformed confessional believer, and so his essay, of course, I was excited to read because I appreciated him so much as a professor. But the other essay that many of them were interacting with was one by Marvin Sweeney, a professor I had for a year at Claremont, who was arguing that that whereas this initial article by Odell was correct about these priestly themes, she was actually going a step too far by claiming that the priestly themes were evidence of him somehow relinquishing a priestly identity. And Dr. Sweeney was saying, no, he's actually acting out, or he's engaging in his prophetic call through his priestly identity. Now, that might sound like we're splitting hairs, and I'm sure some of our readers are going, huh? Well, here's, again, part of it. Remember, this is what a PhD in biblical studies is trying to do, is to really pursue very, very narrow questions and try to rigorously analyze those questions. I mean, that's why getting a doctorate is not for everybody, and it's why it is an exercise that is designed to show a rigorous use of questioning and a rigorous use of interpretive tools. Right. Well, I jumped into that I called that the flurry. I refer to it as the flurry of studies. All of going through even a very very interesting dissertation by T.J. Betts that was done under Daniel Block when Dr. Block was still at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, and Betts and Duguid and a number of others have focused on how Ezekiel, in exile, even though he doesn't have the temple anymore, even though he doesn't have the altar, he is retaining a priestly identity by focusing on the kinds of priestly actions that were available to him in exile, namely teaching Torah. So Dr. Betts' dissertation was titled, Ezekiel the Priest, a Custodian of Torah. And there's a lot of very sound analysis in Dr. Betts's work. I push back against him in places just because that's part of what you do with a dissertation. But I found it to be a very stimulating study, and I'm excited for my brother and colleague. I haven't met him, but I treat him that way. Who's worked in these areas. But what I decided to do with my dissertation is to get back to this flurry, which really ended in 2005, and I couldn't figure out why. It seemed to me it ended at a stalemate because there was a range of reasons why people were affirming Ezekiel's priestly identity and a range of reasons people were rejecting it. So, for example, the real voice was against it was Dr. Baruch Schwartz of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, who wrote not only a chapter in that symposium, but had published a lecture he gave at, I believe, Harvard or Yale, that he very graciously sent me, explaining to him why all of this data showed him merely to be a former priest. And so I was trying to say, well, how might we arbitrate this discussion? Do we have any other interpretive tools available to us? And that might maybe rejuvenate the discussion, and keep it from having ended in 2005. Now, interestingly, I talked with a few of the people, Dr. Andrew Mine, Marvin Sweeney, a few people like that who wrote part of the flurry, and asked, why did it end? And pretty much everyone I talked to said, we got busy with other projects. And so it wasn't like there was a big angry outburst and everybody walked away. That's not how it works in like real rigorous academic study of Scripture. But I still thought this whole idea of job identity might be a way to think through the plausibility of conceiving of Ezekiel as a priest with a priestly work identity and refracting that work identity through the new circumstances of exile that prevented him from working as he had been planning. Remember, he went into exile in the 30th year, which I think clearly refers to his at age 30, when ordinarily he would have entered the priesthood.
Right.
Well, you don't enter the priesthood on a whim, right? He likely spent his growing up time in a priestly family, preparing for that day when he would enter the priesthood. This was common in the ancient world, common up till very recently. It's still common. If your dad did this kind of job, you would do that kind of job. If your family was involved in that kind of industry, that's what you went into. Only rarely did you do something else. And it's reasonable that even within the clan of Levi, or the tribe of Levi, specifically within those priestly circles, the Zadokites and such, you would have expected him to be preparing for that day, and yet in the same year he should have started his job, as it were. Where does he find himself? By the Kebar River in exile. I mean, you and I both went to Dordt College, right? And we spent our 4 years of study gearing up for a profession. And what would that have been like to graduate and be told you will never work in that profession?
Devastating.
Yeah. It's like, what if
time?
Yeah, you'd think, like, what if they banned television or banned, audio recording the year you graduate? You'd be like, now what?
Exactly.
Well, the thing is, that's
identity crisis.
Yeah, well, and that's not so uncommon in our day because of this reality of forced migration throughout the world. We talk about immigration here in the U.S. a lot, and it can be politically fraught, which is unfortunate because forced migration is a real concern. Now, I'm not trying to weigh in politically either here. There's concerns about the migration issue in our country, and that can be debated in other venues. But think, for example, of Syria. I can think of Syria a few years ago, or Ukraine right now. Right? There are migrants fleeing a war zone. Many of them come with specialized work credentials, and now they're in countries that may or may not recognize those work credentials. What do? There's interesting research from the discipline of vocational psychology. That's not a psychology like a Freudian psychology, right? It's like a social psychology. It's something more broadly. There's been some really good work on a Christian use of sociology, like Vern Poythress has a good book, Redeeming Sociology. Russell Hedendorf and Matthew Voss. Voss is now at Covenant College has a book called Hidden Threads, right? There's been a lot of good work looking at Christian use of social psychology and sociology. Just for our listeners' sake, when you hear me saying I'm using psychology, I'm not doing something like Jungian on Ezekiel. But there's been a lot of this vocational psychological work looking at refugees. And there's been studies, for example, of teachers. There's a study of teachers in Scotland who came from like the Middle East. And they came to Scotland because they were escaping war. And Scotland took them in, but they weren't credentialed as educators. And so they're doing good work, but not work that their heart was in. They're driving taxis. They're working as custodians. They're engaged in business. They're working in companies, right? Those are all good work, and you ask those people, and they indicate they're grateful for the good work. But they train to be a teacher for a reason. Same thing with pediatricians. There's stories of doctors and pediatricians in particular who studied because they wanted to help heal children. Mm-hmm. And now in the new country they're at, their medical credentials aren't recognized. Mm-hmm. So what do? Vocational psychology has not only seen that people identify with their work very closely, and I actually think we were created by God to do that. When he said, fill the earth and subdue it, there seems to be a work mandate built into our human nature in the image of God. I don't want to go off into that too much, but I think there's something what you can hopefully hear why this should have some good rings of plausibility to it. One thing, though, vocational psychologists have noted is how people who are doing jobs that are not exactly what they feel called to do, whether calling because they're believers and they feel God's called them, or calling in a more nebulous secular sense, right? That's what's interesting, is that the secular psychological guild has adopted that word calling as well, admitting it's reformed, admitting it came from Luther, but fine, they're able to emphasize something we recognize, that people have a deep desire to do a particular kind of work sometimes. And they've noticed a set of strategies that get used to retool one's job when they're unable to do it. So that now, an example in the literature is a woman who was working in the hospital on the maternity ward. And she was doing the custodial side of things. I believe she was a migrant. And so she came, she had not trained to be a nurse, but she was unsettled anyway. She was no longer in her home country now. I think in the U.S. is where this story took place. And was just a wonderful presence for this. One of the writers was a psychologist who wrote this vocational psychology book, and was just a neat presence for him and his wife as they just had their baby. And she came and just doted over the newborn, just said some very encouraging and sweet things to them as new parents. And so he got to ask her, tell me about your job. You do custodial work here. And she goes, yeah, I guess, but I'm also here to make people's days better. I'm here to give encouragement to new moms who are scared. I'm here to tell new dads they can do this. I'm here to tell the doctors they're doing a great job. And that's not in her job description, right? She's not here. That's not really what the hospital thinks she's there to do. But do you see how she has crafted her job in light of something of an unanswered calling?
Yeah.
And anyway, the literature shows numerous examples of this. Now, I can see a listener going, okay, well, that's all well and good, but this is all modern stuff. Hey, vocational psychologists have said the same thing. It's just the modern thing. Well, a couple of things to note is some of these writers, David Bluestein, for example, has noted that the origins of the discipline of vocational psychology can be traced back to the ancient world, even to the Judeo-Christian tradition, is what he argues. There's an interesting book I came across by scholar Sandra Joschel. It was called Work Identity and Legal Status at Rome, a study of the occupational inscriptions. Now, what is that, you might wonder? This book, it was in the University of Oklahoma Classics series. It's a pretty dense study, but it's looking at tomb inscriptions in ancient Rome of basically slaves. And it's noting how many slaves, again, you got to think of a slave in the ancient Rome, not like a, sort of an indentured servant kind of slave. How many of them on their funeral inscriptions indicated the jobs they did in their indentured status. Their families wanted to identify them as a cupbearer or as a, this kind of employee or that kind of slave or that kind of, right? That's fascinating that there's such an interest and a belief in the importance of one's unique work contribution that presumably these individuals would have been happy to be remembered that way with their funeral inscriptions, and their families wanted them remembered that way. Well, you go even further back into the Old Testament, and I mean, you have this fascinating passage even in Genesis 4, right? Genesis 4, verse 20, Ada gave birth to Yabel. He was the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. Interesting. Here he is being, this job of herding is sort of traced back now through this genealogy to Ada. His brother's name was Ubal. He was the father of all those who play the lyre and the pipe. I remember there was a Dutch drum and bugle corps about 20 years ago that came and visited the United States called Ubal. And it was they're called Ubal after Ubal from the Bible because they were playing brass music and percussion down in Indianapolis. So on the football field. A lot of fun. Goes on, as for Zillah, she also gave birth to Tubal-Cain, the forger of all implements of bronze and iron. And the sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. Right, here's now metal forging, smithing, right? It goes on. There's all these kinds of job descriptions. That's a very small little thing. But you find people's professions mentioned at a number of places in the Old Testament. And it seems that job identity was operative. No, it's not. It's not at the front and center. I'm not claiming that in the dissertation. And none of us should be like overreading this. My preaching hasn't somehow become job-centered preaching, right, when I'm looking at Genesis 4. But these are the kinds of historical details that are embedded into this account. We also find, interestingly, a number of Hebrew inscriptions from the time of the Old Testament that also relate job titles. There's a number of job titles. There's job descriptions. Very interesting situation is the title, the priest, which hopefully you can sense is relevant to what I've been trying to look at with Ezekiel, because there's a number of people whose names are so-and-so the priest. And one really fascinating archaeological find was a small seal, like a little thing you would stamp your name into, and it was so-and-so the priest. And it was mounted on a ring. Why? You could maybe try to argue, well, that's so that they could stamp it with their fist. Okay, maybe it involved administrative work at the temple, receiving of offerings or receiving of supplies, right? It could be that, but the gold it was embedded in was very flimsy, not exactly like a workplace item. I don't know if you remember that movie, Catch Me If You Can.
Oh, yeah.
Remember, and he was talking at the end about, he says, oh, this forged check is from a bank teller. How do you know? It's because the 9 and the 6 are both broken. That happens when he stole it from a bank teller. That's what happens on those stamps. Well, you can tell, like they make these stamps to be resilient. Well, this was decorative. Why? Now we can only speculate, but it's possible at least that you have this priest valuing this priestly identity so much so that it's now part of their ring. I don't know if it did in Canada for you, but we had class rings in high school.
I did not.
You did not. Good for you. I stupidly convinced my parents to let me spend the money on it. But mine had things I was interested in, music on one side and the Bible on another, I think. Right? Your jewelry is often endowed with the kinds of things that you value.
Yeah.
Anyway, we have a number of these kinds of inscriptions that seem to indicate that not only job identity is an important thing across cultures and across history, but that specifically priestly job identities were valuable in Israel. And that would, to my mind, start to tilt the scales of that flurry of debate back toward those people who were arguing, along with Dr. Sweeney, that Ezekiel's prophetic ministry was conducted with a deep sense of his priestly vocational identity. And that helps to explain a number of things we find in the book.
So when you read the book of Ezekiel, you'll notice sometimes that he does some very interesting sign acts. That's a word that Reverend Compton mentioned in this episode. So in the next week, we'll see how this work of Ezekiel in performing sign acts resembles the work of this priest prophet that he has been commissioned to be. Stay tuned next time for that. To listen to more episodes, you can find us at midamerica.edu/podcasts and wherever you listen to your favorite shows. I'm Jared Luchabor. Till next time.